Hello everyone, so in this lecture video I will be talking about the respiratory system. This is probably going to be the first of two videos covering the respiratory system. So there are general functions of the respiratory system that is shown on the slide. Obviously the most important part of that function is actually the second function, which is the site for oxygen and carbon dioxide exchange. Now first and the second bullet is related because you cannot have oxygen and carbon dioxide exchange or gas exchange without a proper and patent air passageway. All right. Odor detection and sound production are secondary things, but obviously are very, very important, especially for sound production for the social aspects in communicating with other members of our species or even other species as well. But again, know these four general functions, but again the most important one is the first and second function, which are directly related to each other. So where do gas exchange occur? So gas exchange occurs actually in two different locations. It occurs in the lungs. So this actually is in the lungs, in which there is this thing called alveolar gas exchange that happens in the alveolus, which is the terminal portions of the respiratory tree. And what happens is oxygen then from the atmosphere, from the outside air, enters red blood cells that are in the capillaries in the alveolus, and carbon dioxide exits and to be exhaled at that point. The second type of gas exchange actually occurs in the capillaries, and this actually occurs in systemic cells. And the movement of oxygen is actually reversed. Oxygen in this case enters the systemic cells to be used for ATP production, and carbon dioxide then exits and actually enters the veins, where it then terminates in the alveolus. Right? Gas transport again is very important. Gas transport is in this case actually predominantly a function of the cardiovascular system. But also note that gas transport, especially in terms of ventilation, pulmonary ventilation, is actually the function of the respiratory tree. We're talking about the trachea, the nasal passages, okay, the primary bronchioles, so on and so forth. All right. So again, two types of gas exchange. And just note that there's a difference in the oxygen movement here. So this side is oxygen rich, and this side is oxygen poor. So there are two ways that you can actually classify the respiratory system. The first one is through structure. So if you already remember, the structural organization and functional organization was also present in terms of joints and also in terms of the nervous system. So in this case, right, the structural organization divides the respiratory tract into an upper and lower tracts, and the division point for that is actually your voice box. All right, so the larynx. All right, so then the larynx, the voice box, is actually comprised of multiple cartilages. The most dominant cartilage is actually the epiglottis. Right, so upper is above that, lower respiratory tract is below that. And if you have ever heard about upper respiratory infections and low respiratory infections, they're actually talking about this type of classification. On the other hand, we actually have a functional organization. In functional organization, most of the area of the respiratory tract is actually called the conducting zone, and only a small portion of it, the terminal portion, is actually called the respiratory zone. What is the difference between a conducting zone and a respiratory zone? The conducting zone is just the area in which gas is actually transported in pulmonary ventilation. And the respiratory zone is the site of, in this case, alveolar gas exchange. So alveolar gas exchange only occurs in the respiratory zone. Obviously, you do not absorb oxygen in the trachea or any of those other upper passages upstream of the alveolus. Okay, so again, two ways: structural organization divided by the larynx, functional organization based on function. No gas exchange, gas exchange. So the respiratory mucosa and the respiratory mucosa, we're just talking about the epithelium that actually lines the, in this case, the respiratory passages, actually starts thicker and actually ends up thinner. And the reason why that is the functions on the upper respiratory tract and the function in the alveolus are actually two different things. So in the upper passages of your respiratory tract, one of the primary functions is protection. The humidification, which means that you want the air coming in to actually be humidified, because dry air is very, very painful for the respiratory system. And the other function of the upper respiratory tract is to actually warm the air as they actually enter, in this case, the passageways. All right, and that is why your nose, okay, your nasal passage is actually quiet. It's very, very high in vasculature. And that is why if you've ever had a broken nose, you would understand what that means, okay? So in the upper respiratory tract, we actually have pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium. One of the purpose of that is to create mucus, okay? And again, mucus is multiple things, predominantly protection, warming of air, okay? That sort of function. As you go down lower, all right, specifically in the alveolus, in the conductings, especially in the respiratory zone, what happens then is you need to have exchange here. You need to have gas exchange in the respiratory zone. Okay, and so this is why you have a simple squamous epithelium, so that gas, oxygen, readily diffuses from an area of greater concentration to lower concentration. So in here, I'm pointing, this area would be the outside air, and this side would be the capillaries where red blood cells are actually circulating, okay, from the pulmonary arteries, okay? So again, here, protective, you actually have humidifying and warming functions. In this case, the primary purpose is gas exchange. So obviously you cannot exchange gas when you have a thick wall like this, okay? So this is the structure of the bronchial wall. Interestingly, the upper respiratory patch, and we're talking about the trachea here, the respiratory tree, starting from the trachea, actually has cartilaginous rings that actually, in this case, is actually C-shaped. It doesn't completely cover the actual trachea. If you see here up on the upper, like on the upper portions of this diagram, you can see that the back portion does not, this ring, this cartilage ring is actually C-shaped. It doesn't completely enclose the trachea. And the reason why this is because the trachea is actually anterior to the esophagus. Okay, so when you swallow food, you need to have an area in which the esophagus can actually expand. And so if the trachea was wholly, in this case, enclosed by a cartilaginous ring, what would happen then is the esophagus will not properly inflate. The other thing is, obviously, there has to be some form of expansion when you actually take big gulps of air. And I shouldn't say gulp because that's just a terrible misnomer, but big breaths of air. Okay? As you go down the respiratory tree, this is the actually main bronchus. Actually, this is the trachea, then you have the main bronchus or the primary bronchus. It divides. Okay? And if you can see this, you can actually see that you have lobar bronchus. And the reason why they're called lobar is they go to 3 lobes. There are 3 lobes. I don't know if you guys can see this. And there's 2 lobes on this side, okay, of the actual respirator. So I hope you understand. We're going to talk about that. I'll hope a little bit more when it talks about like anatomy in this case, all right? So you have lobar bronchus depending on how many lobes are inside. So obviously on the right side, you're going to have, in this case, you should have 3 lobes. And then on the left side, you should only have 2 lobes, okay? So you have 3 lobar bronchus or secondary bronchus. And then if they divide further, then what happens then is you have tertiary bronchus, so on and so forth, okay? So what happens is, once the name bronchus disappears and it becomes a bronchiole, the bronchioles do not have any more of these cartilaginous rings. As you guys can see, there's cartilage here. Once you hit the bronchiole, there is no cartilage that encloses it. What actually happens is this area then, as shown here, is subject to bronchoconstriction and bronchodilation. This is during an asthma attack, right? So the bronchioles actually, in this case, by themselves autonomically actually constrict, depriving you of air. You take a whiff of your inhaler, and what happens is the bronchioles then gets dilated, bronchodilation. You cannot constrict and dilate into large extents the parts of the respiratory tree that has cartilage enclosing them. However, in the side, this is the only place that you can actually affect. So again, if you keep going, respiratory bronchioles and the alveolus, this is actually again the area in which gas exchange actually occurs, or this is actually the part of the respiratory zone. Okay, so again, this is to prevent the collapse, okay, obviously of your big portions of your respiratory tree. And just know the other terms for the main bronchus, which is primary bronchus, secondary bronchus, tertiary bronchus, so on and so forth. Okay. So if you look closely at the alveolus again are simple squamous epithelium. So in this case, if you look at this one, these are cells. So this type 1 cell, if you look at this, are actually epithelial cells. Okay, so this is simple squamous epithelium. Then you have a type 2 cell. Type 2 cell is just macrophages, or in this case, not just macrophages, but actually, my mistake, those are actually surfactant producers. So they actually create a fluid called surfactant. Okay, so type 2 creates surfactant, type 1 is just the simple squamous epithelium. Now, the purpose of the surfactant, as you know, is when you exhale, this alveolus obviously collapses a little bit. If you do not have surfactant, which is produced by type 2 cells, what happens is the walls of this alveolus will stick together and therefore will not inflate properly when the next breath of air comes in. Okay, this is actually a disorder that is actually known to actually, in this case, affect a lot of newborns. All right, so there's a lack of surfactant. All right, so it's actually called respiratory distress syndrome, RDS, in this case. So those are the two types of primary cells. Then you have alveolar macrophages, and their purpose why they're circulating in this area is to, in this case, clear out debris or clear out infectious microorganisms like bacteria, viruses, so on and so forth. This capillaries here is again the reason why you have capillaries that actually, in this case, penetrates all the alveolus is because this is again the site of gas exchange. So oxygen comes from this area and enters the capillaries where they actually then are taken up by the red blood cells, okay, which is primarily shown here. So again, type 1, epithelial cells, type 2, cells that create surfactant, okay, and then alveolar macrophages. So this is the structure of the alveolus. The reason why they have this grape-like things is to increase the surface area for gas exchange, right? If the more surface area you have, the more gas exchange actually occurs. So I am gonna stop here and continue on with the next lecture. So please watch the next lecture, starting with this slide.